There is a building in Wilmington, Delaware that you would never photograph on purpose. It sits at 1209 North Orange Street, a squat two-story block of tan brick and tinted glass, wedged between a parking lot and a stretch of road that most locals pass without a second glance. No sculpture in the lobby, no corporate flag, no name carved into stone above the door. And yet, on paper, this single unremarkable structure is the legal home of more companies than any tower in Manhattan, more than any skyscraper in London, Hong Kong, or Dubai. At its peak, roughly 285,000 businesses listed this exact address as their official headquarters. Think about what that number actually means. Not 285,000 employees, not 285,000 offices. 285,000 separate corporations, limited liability companies, and holding entities, each one legally residing behind the same set of doors. Google has been here. Coca-Cola has been here. American Airlines, Walmart, and a long procession of banks whose names you would recognize from the last financial crisis. So have thousands of companies whose names you will never learn, because their entire purpose is to make sure you never do. The people who work inside are not executives. They are registered agents, clerks, and administrators whose job is to receive mail, forward legal notices, and keep a filing cabinet's worth of paperwork in order. The building doesn't manufacture anything. It doesn't sell anything. What it produces is something far more valuable in the modern economy: a legal fiction. The fiction that a company born in California, run from New York, and selling to customers in Texas can somehow, for the purposes that matter most, exist in a state most of its owners have never set foot in. To understand why so many of the world's most powerful corporations have chosen to plant their flag in a building that looks like a suburban dentist's office, you have to stop thinking about geography and start thinking about law. Because Delaware doesn't sell land. It doesn't sell labor or resources or access to a market. Delaware sells a product no factory can replicate: a set of rules, a court system, and a promise of predictability so refined that companies will pay hundreds of dollars a year forever just to be governed by it. And that product has made the second smallest state in America the quiet capital of global capitalism. This is the story of how a state of barely 1 million people came to host nearly 2 million companies. It's the story of a loophole that costs other states billions, an address that shelters fortunes from scrutiny, and a system so effective that when the United States finally tried to shine a light into it, the light was switched back off within a matter of years. Follow the money far enough, and it doesn't lead to a Caribbean island or a Swiss vault. It leads here up to a low brick building on Orange Street and to the machine humming quietly behind it. Delaware is easy to miss. It is the second smallest state in the Union by area, a sliver of land on the Atlantic coast that you can drive across in under an hour. Fewer than 1.5 million people live there. It has no major financial center, no global port to rival New York or Los Angeles, no natural resource that the rest of the world depends on. By every ordinary measure of economic power, Delaware should be a footnote. Instead, it is one of the most important addresses in the entire architecture of global business. Consider the arithmetic that makes no intuitive sense. Delaware is home to more than 1.8 million active business entities, more registered companies than it has human residents. 2 out of every 3 Fortune 500 companies are incorporated there. The overwhelming majority of American companies that go public choose Delaware as their legal home before they ever ring the opening bell. In a single recent year, nearly 290,000 brand new entities were formed in the state. That's roughly 1 new company every 2 minutes, around the clock, all year long, in a place where almost none of them will ever open an office. The gap between what Delaware is and what Delaware does is the first clue that something unusual is happening. When a company incorporates somewhere, it isn't necessarily moving its people, its factories, or its customers there. Incorporation is a legal act, not a physical one. It means choosing which state's laws will govern the company's internal life, how its board can act, what rights its shareholders have, how disputes get resolved, and how much protection its executives enjoy when things go wrong. And in that invisible marketplace for corporate law, Delaware has spent more than a century building an almost unbreakable monopoly. The rest of America has largely made its peace with this. When a startup in Silicon Valley raises money, its investors will often insist it become a Delaware corporation before they wire a cent. When a giant like Walmart or Amazon structures its empire, Delaware entities sit quietly at the center of the diagram. The state has become the default, the safe, boring, expected choice, to the point where choosing anywhere else can look like a red flag to lawyers and financiers. Being from Delaware in the corporate world is a little like having a passport everyone recognizes. But defaults are never accidents. Somebody built this one, deliberately, over decades, and Delaware has fought to protect it just as deliberately. To see how a coastal afterthought became the courthouse of American capitalism, you have to go back more than 100 years to a rivalry between two states, a future president of the United States, and a decision that handed Delaware a prize it has never let go of since. At the end of the 19th century, the state winning the race to host America's corporations was not Delaware. It was New Jersey. As the great industrial trusts of the Gilded Age took shape, the oil empires, the railroads, the steel combinations, New Jersey rewrote its laws to welcome them. In 1896, it passed one of the first modern enabling corporate statutes, a set of rules deliberately designed to make life easy for the men who controlled these enormous new companies. Businesses flooded in, the fees poured into the state treasury. New Jersey became, for a brief moment, the incorporation capital of the United States. Delaware watched its larger neighbor grow rich and decided to copy the formula. In 1899, the state passed its own general corporation law, modeled closely on New Jersey's. For a while, it was the imitator, not the leader, a smaller state offering a slightly cheaper version of the same product. If nothing had changed in New Jersey, Delaware might have stayed a minor player forever. But something did change, and it came from an unlikely source, a reform-minded governor who would soon become president. His name was Woodrow Wilson. Elected governor of New Jersey in 1910, Wilson rode a wave of public anger against the very trusts his state had welcomed. He believed monopolies were strangling American opportunity, and he set out to break their grip. In his final stretch as governor, he pushed through a package of antitrust laws that came to be known as the Seven Sisters, statutes that cracked down on the trusts, tightened the rules, and stripped away much of what had made New Jersey so attractive to big business in the first place. Wilson went to Washington in 1913 as a national hero of reform. He left behind a New Jersey that corporations no longer trusted. The money did not simply evaporate, it moved. Corporations began quietly shifting their legal homes across the river to the one state that had preserved the friendly, hands-off approach New Jersey had just abandoned. Delaware, the patient imitator, suddenly found itself holding the crown by default. It had done nothing dramatic to win. It had simply refused to change while its rival reformed itself out of the business. And this time, Delaware understood exactly what it had, and resolved never to repeat New Jersey's mistake. That resolution became the guiding principle of Delaware statecraft for the next century. Where other states might tighten their rules under political pressure, Delaware would keep its promise to management steady, predictable, and permanent. It would treat corporate law not as an ethical question, but as a product to be maintained and improved, generation after generation. The lesson of New Jersey was seared into the state's memory. The throne could be stolen, so it must be guarded. And to guard it, Delaware built something no rival has ever managed to replicate: a court. If Delaware's laws are the product, its Court of Chancery is the reason anyone trusts the brand. Founded in an era when most Americans were farmers, the Court of Chancery is one of the oldest business courts in the world, and it is unlike almost any other courtroom you will ever encounter. There is no jury. Cases are decided by a small group of judges, called chancellors and vice-chancellors, who do nothing but corporate and business law day after day, year after year. They are specialists in a way that ordinary judges juggling murder trials and divorce cases could never be. The absence of a jury is not a small detail. It is the whole point. When a billion-dollar dispute over a merger lands in Delaware, it is not decided by 12 citizens pulled from daily life and asked to referee arguments about fiduciary duty and shareholder rights. It is decided by a judge who has ruled on hundreds of nearly identical cases. That produces something corporations crave above almost anything else: predictability. A company can look at how Delaware has ruled for decades and make a reasonable guess about how it will rule tomorrow. In business, that kind of certainty is worth a fortune. Behind those rulings sits an enormous library of precedent, more than 2 centuries of accumulated decisions covering nearly every conceivable corporate conflict. When executives clash with shareholders, when boards fight over takeovers, when one billionaire accuses another of self-dealing, Delaware almost certainly has a prior case that maps the terrain. Lawyers around the world are trained to think in the language of Delaware corporate law precisely because so much of the map has already been drawn. This depth is a moat no other state can cross overnight, no matter how business-friendly its statutes look on paper. And the court is fast. Corporate disputes that might drag on for years in an ordinary courtroom can be resolved in Delaware in months, sometimes weeks, when the stakes demand speed. For a company in the middle of a contested merger or a hostile takeover, where every day of uncertainty can wipe out billions in market value, that speed is not a luxury. It is the entire reason to be there. Delaware has effectively built an express lane for high-stakes corporate justice, and companies pay handsomely for the ticket. Put it all together, the specialized judges, the mountain of precedent, the speed, the predictability, and you begin to see why the low brick building on Orange Street is so crowded. Companies are not flocking to Delaware for its beaches or its tax rates alone. They are buying access to a legal system engineered over more than 100 years to treat them with expertise and consistency. But a court like this does not run on goodwill. It runs on money. And the way Delaware collects that money is a masterpiece of quiet design. Ask most people how a state pays its bills, and they'll say income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, the familiar burdens that land on ordinary residents. Delaware has quietly built a different kind of treasury. A remarkable share of the state's revenue comes not from its own citizens, but from the millions of companies that incorporate there and never send a single employee. The instrument that makes this possible has an unglamorous name: the franchise tax. And it is one of the most lucrative arrangements any American state has ever devised. The franchise tax is, in essence, a fee for the privilege of being a Delaware company. Every entity incorporated in the state pays it year after year simply to keep its legal home in good standing. Add to that the filing fees, the formation fees, and the steady drip of charges that accompany the paperwork of corporate life, and the totals become staggering for a state this size. Corporate franchise taxes and related fees generate somewhere between a quarter and a third of Delaware's entire general fund, on the order of $1.5 to $2 billion a year, flowing in from companies that mostly exist elsewhere. Consider what that means for the average Delawarean. Because hundreds of thousands of out-of-state corporations are effectively subsidizing the state budget, the burden on actual residents is lighter than it would otherwise be. Delaware charges no state sales tax, and its personal income taxes are relatively modest. In a very real sense, the shell companies of the world are helping to pave Delaware's roads and fund its schools. The state has monetized its own reputation, turning a legal product into a revenue stream that its neighbors can only envy. This is the mechanism that keeps everything else honest. Because incorporation is such a critical source of income, Delaware has every incentive to protect the product that generates it. The state cannot afford to let its courts grow unpredictable, its laws grow hostile, or its reputation grow tarnished, because the moment companies begin to doubt whether Delaware is worth it, the Golden Goose stops laying. Politicians in Delaware of both parties understand this in their bones. Guarding the incorporation franchise is not a partisan issue there. It is a matter of state survival. And so a self-reinforcing loop was born. Companies come for the law and the court. Their fees fund the law and the court. The law and the court stay excellent because the fees keep flowing. Round and round it goes, decade after decade, each turn strengthening Delaware's grip. But this elegant machine has a second function that its architects rarely advertise. Because the same system that offers world-class corporate justice also offers something murkier and far more controversial: a place to make money quietly disappear. Return to that building on Orange Street and ask the obvious question: how can 285,000 companies possibly share one address? The answer is an entire industry most people have never heard of: the business of the registered agent. Every company incorporated in Delaware is required by law to have an agent in the state, a designated point of contact to receive official documents and legal notices. But that agent doesn't need to be an office, a staff, or any real presence. It can be a single company that agrees to act as the official address for hundreds of thousands of others. The building at 1209 North Orange Street houses one of the largest of these operations. For a modest annual fee, a registered agent will let your company use its address, accept your legal mail, and forward the paperwork that keeps you compliant. Multiply that small fee by hundreds of thousands of clients, and you have a thriving enterprise built entirely on paperwork. The agent doesn't need to know what your company does. It doesn't need to know who really owns it. It simply needs to be there, on file, so the state has somewhere to send a subpoena. This is what turns incorporation into something close to a vending machine. In many cases, forming a Delaware company takes less time than opening a bank account. You submit a name, pay a fee, designate a registered agent, and within a day you can have a fully legal entity, capable of owning property, signing contracts, opening accounts, and moving money, all without ever revealing on the public record the name of the human being who actually controls it. The company exists. The person behind it can remain a ghost. For legitimate businesses, this efficiency is a genuine convenience. A startup founder can incorporate overnight and get on with building a product. A large corporation can spin up subsidiaries as easily as opening new folders. There is nothing inherently sinister about a registered agent. It is a normal, lawful part of how American business works. The problem is that the same frictionless system that serves the honest entrepreneur serves the money launderer, the sanctions evader, and the corrupt official just as well, and asks them just as few questions. That is the quiet tension at the heart of Delaware's model. The features that make it attractive to the Fortune 500, speed, privacy, minimal disclosure, a hands-off state, are precisely the features that make it attractive to those with something to hide. A single address can hold a technology giant's holding company and an anonymous shell used to buy a mansion with dirty money. And from the outside, on the public filing, the two can look almost identical. To understand how that anonymity becomes a weapon, you have to look at one specific trick that made Delaware infamous among the tax authorities of every other state. Among accountants and state tax officials, it has a nickname, the Delaware Loophole. And for decades, it has quietly drained billions of dollars out of the treasuries of other states. The mechanism sounds technical, but its logic is simple, almost elegant once you see it. It turns Delaware's light-touch tax code into a machine for making profits vanish from the places where they are actually earned and reappear in a state that won't tax them. Here's how it works. A large retailer operating in dozens of states creates a subsidiary in Delaware, a holding company, whose only real job is to own something intangible, like the company's trademarks, brand names, or logos. The famous example is a toy retailer that placed the rights to its cartoon mascot inside a Delaware entity. Then every store across the country pays that Delaware subsidiary a royalty for the right to use the brand. Those royalty payments are treated as a business expense in the states where the stores operate, shrinking the taxable profit there. And when the money lands in Delaware, the state's code imposes no tax on income from intangible assets. The profit has effectively teleported into a tax-free zone. The scale of this quiet extraction is enormous. A landmark investigation more than a decade ago estimated that the Delaware loophole had cost other states on the order of $9.5 billion in lost revenue over just 10 years. Academic studies of corporations using the strategy found that the average firm employing a Delaware passive investment company cut its state tax bill by somewhere between 15% and 24%, with typical annual savings running into the millions of dollars per company. That is money that would otherwise have funded schools, roads, and services in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in the states where the actual selling happens. What makes the loophole so galling to those states is that nothing about it is illegal. It is not fraud. It is not hidden. It is a structure built openly by some of the most respected corporations in America, blessed by armies of tax lawyers and operating exactly as designed. States like Pennsylvania have spent years trying to close the gap, passing add-back laws and fighting court battles to claw the revenue back. But every workaround invites a new maneuver, and the fundamental asymmetry remains. Delaware profits when other states lose, and Delaware has no incentive to stop. This is the deeper truth the loophole reveals. Delaware's system is not just a neutral service for organizing companies. It is, in part, a redistribution machine. pulling tax revenue away from the states where economic activity really occurs, and channeling the benefits toward a single small jurisdiction, and the corporations savvy enough to use it. And once you accept that a company's profits can be legally relocated to a place they were never earned, the next step is almost inevitable. If you can hide a profit, you can hide a person. And that is where Delaware's story stops being about taxes and starts being about secrecy. The corporation was invented to make ownership visible and accountable, a way to pool money and share risk under a name the public could see. Somewhere along the way, in Delaware and states like it, that logic quietly inverted. The modern American shell company can be engineered to do the opposite of what corporations were meant to do, to make ownership invisible. And the key to that vanishing act is the limited liability company, the humble LLC, combined with a public record that asks almost nothing about who is really in charge. When you form an LLC in Delaware, you are not required to list the names of its true owners on the public filing. You provide a company name and a registered agent, and that can be enough. The actual human being who controls the company, who receives its profits, who directs its money, can remain entirely off the public record. Layer 1 anonymous LLC inside another and another, spread them across a few states or a few countries, and you can build a structure where tracing the real owner becomes a forensic project that takes investigators months if they can do it at all. This is not a hypothetical concern dreamed up by activists. It is the documented reality that has surfaced again and again in law enforcement cases and journalistic investigations. Anonymous American shell companies have been used to buy luxury real estate with the proceeds of foreign corruption, to move money for sanctioned individuals, and to obscure the trail behind fraud schemes. In case after case, the paper trail runs into a Delaware or Nevada or Wyoming entity and simply stops, because there is no name behind the name. Only another company and another receding into the dark. What makes this so striking is the contrast with America's own rhetoric. For years, the United States lectured the world about offshore secrecy. It pressured Switzerland to crack open its famous bank accounts. It pushed Caribbean islands to hand over the names behind their shell companies. It built a global system called FATCA to force foreign banks to report on American account holders. And all the while inside its own borders, it was running one of the most permissive company formation regimes on Earth, one that asked foreigners for far less than it demanded of everyone else. The result is a kind of one-way mirror. America can see into the financial affairs of much of the world, thanks to the reporting it requires from other countries. But the world often cannot see into America because states like Delaware never built the same disclosure into their own systems. For anyone with money to hide, whether an honest citizen guarding their privacy or a kleptocrat laundering a stolen fortune, that asymmetry is the whole appeal. And by the early 2020s, the people who measure these things had reached a conclusion that should have been a scandal, but somehow wasn't. Every 2 years, an organization called the Tax Justice Network publishes a ranking it calls the Financial Secrecy Index. It is a careful, methodical attempt to answer a simple question: which country does the most to help the world's wealth hide from scrutiny? The index doesn't just measure how secretive a jurisdiction's laws are, it weighs that secrecy against the sheer volume of financial services the place provides to non-residents. It is, in effect, a map of where the world's hidden money actually goes. And in its 2022 edition, the country sitting at the very top of that map was not a palm-fringed island. It was the United States of America. For the first time, the United States ranked as the single largest enabler of financial secrecy on the planet, ahead of Switzerland, ahead of the Cayman Islands, ahead of every jurisdiction whose name has become shorthand for offshore money. The researchers found that America supplied nearly twice as much financial secrecy as the second-place country. This was not a marginal finding or a rounding error. It was a declaration that the world's largest economy had become, by this measure, the world's most important tax haven, hiding in plain sight behind the language of law and order. How did America climb to the top? Partly by standing still while others moved. As country after country signed on to international agreements to share financial information automatically, telling each other's tax authorities about accounts held by foreigners, the United States largely declined to reciprocate. It happily collected data on Americans abroad through its own reporting laws. but it did not sign up to the global standard that would have required it to hand over equivalent information about the foreigners' parking money inside its borders. The rest of the world grew more transparent. America, in relative terms, grew more opaque. The irony is almost too sharp to be believed. The nation that had spent a generation crusading against offshore secrecy had quietly become its largest practitioner. Money that once fled to Zurich or the Caymans found that it no longer needed to leave the reach of American power at all. It could simply move inside it, into a Delaware LLC or a trust in a quiet Midwestern state, and enjoy secrecy at least as robust as anything the old havens offered, with the added protection of the world's most powerful legal and financial system standing guard over it. That last point is what makes the American model so formidable. Offshore havens have always carried a whiff of risk, a sense that the ground could shift, that a government could collapse or a bank could fail. America offers secrecy without that fragility. It combines the discretion of an offshore island with the stability of a superpower. For anyone deciding where in the world to place money, they would rather no one examine too closely. That is an almost irresistible pitch. And nowhere did that pitch prove more seductive than in a state better known for prairies and presidents carved into a mountainside. In 2021, a global consortium of journalists released a trove of leaked documents that came to be known as the Pandora Papers. Millions of files exposing how the world's wealthy and powerful hide their fortunes. Buried in that flood of revelations was a finding that stunned even seasoned investigators. Some of the money moving out of the old, notorious offshore havens was not heading to another island. It was heading to the United States, and specifically to the plains of South Dakota. South Dakota has a population smaller than many American cities and a landscape defined by open sky. Yet over the past 2 decades, it has transformed itself into one of the most powerful secrecy jurisdictions on Earth, a destination for the kind of money that once flowed only to Switzerland or the Caribbean. The vehicle for this transformation is the trust, a legal arrangement that lets one party hold assets for the benefit of another. And South Dakota has spent years, session after legislative session, rewriting its trust laws to be as accommodating to wealth as any place in the world. The numbers tell the story. In the space of roughly a decade, the assets held in South Dakota trusts more than quadrupled, swelling to something in the neighborhood of $360 billion. The Pandora Papers linked dozens of these trusts to foreign figures from around the globe, including some connected to allegations of fraud, bribery, and human rights abuses. Money with a troubling history in its home country could arrive on the American prairie and be wrapped in layers of legal protection that made it nearly untouchable. Investigators concluded that South Dakota now rivals the most opaque jurisdictions in Europe and the Caribbean in financial secrecy. One feature in particular turned South Dakota into a magnet. The state abolished the ancient legal rule that once forced trusts to eventually expire. In most of history, wealth locked in a trust had to be released after a set period so that no family could hoard assets forever. South Dakota swept that limit away, allowing what are known as dynasty trusts, arrangements that can, in theory, shelter a family's fortune from taxation across generations, forever. For the ultra-wealthy, that is close to the Holy Grail, a way to freeze a fortune in place, out of reach of tax collectors, and, in many cases, out of reach of scrutiny, for centuries. So the picture completes itself. Delaware perfected the anonymous company. South Dakota perfected the everlasting trust. Nevada and Wyoming added their own variations. And together, quietly, these American states assembled a domestic offshore system that could compete with anything the wider world had to offer. By the early 2020s, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The smart money was no longer fleeing America to hide. It was fleeing to America to hide. And that realization finally provoked Washington to act, or at least to appear to. For years, reformers had pushed for a simple idea. If you form a company in the United States, you should have to tell the government who actually owns it. Not a registered agent, not a shell within a shell. The real human beneficial owner. In 2021, after a long fight, that idea finally became law. Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, requiring companies to report their true owners to a federal financial crimes bureau so that law enforcement could finally pierce the anonymity that had made American shells so attractive to criminals. On paper, it was the most significant crack in the wall of corporate secrecy in a generation. The law was supposed to build a confidential registry of the people behind America's millions of companies. It would not be public, but it would exist. A database that investigators chasing money launderers, sanctions evaders, and fraudsters could finally consult. Supporters hailed it as the moment America stopped preaching transparency abroad while practicing secrecy at home. For a brief window, it looked as though the anonymous shell company's long reign in the United States might be coming to an end. Then came the reversal. The law was challenged in court, tangled in litigation, and met with fierce resistance from business groups who called it burdensome. And in early 2025, the federal government effectively gutted it. Regulators issued a new rule that exempted domestic companies, the very entities the law had been written to expose, from the reporting requirement altogether. Overnight, the obligation to disclose true ownership was lifted from the overwhelming majority of American companies. By the government's own reckoning, the change exempted well over 99% of the entities that were supposed to report. Only foreign companies registering to do business in the United States were left on the hook, and even they were not required to name their American owners. In other words, the great transparency reform of 2021 was, within a few years, quietly narrowed until it barely touched the problem it was designed to solve. The registry that was meant to unmask the anonymous American shell would now cover almost none of them. Government watchdogs warned of the consequences, cautioning that the expanded exemptions would leave serious gaps in the country's ability to track illicit money. The law was not repealed. It remained on the books, its constitutionality upheld by the courts. But its teeth had been pulled. A final rule was promised. Enforcement could theoretically return. But for now, the anonymous company was safe again. This is the pattern that defines the American haven, and it is worth sitting with. Again and again, the system moves toward reform under public pressure, then quietly retreats once the cameras look away. New Jersey reformed and lost its corporations to Delaware. The world demanded transparency, and America climbed to the top of the secrecy rankings. Congress passed a landmark disclosure law, and regulators hollowed it out within 4 years. The machine does not break. It bends, waits, and springs back into shape. To understand why it is so resilient, you have to look honestly at who benefits, because the answer is not just criminals in the shadows. It would be easy and misleading to tell this story as a simple tale of villains. The truth is more uncomfortable because the American incorporation system is what engineers call dual use. The same features that serve legitimate business also serve the illegitimate, and the two are woven together so tightly that you cannot cut one without cutting the other. Every argument for the system's convenience is also, quietly, an argument for its abuse. Consider the honest side of the ledger. The vast majority of Delaware companies are exactly what they appear to be. Ordinary businesses using a trusted, efficient legal framework. A startup incorporates in Delaware because its investors demand the familiarity of Delaware law. A multinational uses Delaware subsidiaries to organize a sprawling global operation in a coherent way. A small business owner forms an LLC to shield personal assets from lawsuits, a perfectly legal and sensible thing to do. For these users, Delaware's speed, privacy, and predictability are simply good governance. There is nothing scandalous about wanting a stable, well-run legal home for your company. But the same door that lets in the founder lets in the fraudster. And the system is deliberately built not to ask which is which. The privacy that protects a legitimate business owner from nosy competitors also protects a corrupt official from investigators. The speed that lets an entrepreneur incorporate overnight also lets a launderer spin up a disposable shell before the ink is dry on a suspicious transaction. The layering that helps a multinational organize its subsidiaries also helps a kleptocrat bury his ownership under a dozen nested entities. Every feature is a coin with two faces, and the state, by design, chooses not to look too closely at which face is showing. This is why reform is so genuinely hard, and not merely because of lobbying. Any rule strict enough to stop the bad actors will also inconvenience the millions of honest ones. Require every company to verify and disclose its true owners, and you burden the legitimate startup along with the shell. Slow down the formation process to allow for scrutiny, and you slow it down for everyone. The defenders of the system are not only launderers and their enablers, They include ordinary business groups who genuinely value the ease and privacy the system provides, and who fight disclosure requirements they see as costly and intrusive. The coalition protecting the status quo is broad precisely because the system's benefits are real. And so the machine endures, held in place not by a conspiracy, but by an equilibrium, a balance of interests in which too many powerful and ordinary people alike have a stake in keeping things roughly as they are. That equilibrium has proven remarkably stable. But stability is not the same as permanence, and in the last few years, the first serious cracks have appeared in the foundation of Delaware's dominance. They came not from reformers or regulators, but from an unexpected direction, from the very corporations Delaware exists to serve. For over a century, Delaware's grip on corporate America looked unshakable. Then, in January 2024, a single court ruling sent a tremor through the entire system. The Delaware Court of Chancery struck down Elon Musk's pay package at Tesla, a compensation deal worth, on paper, around $56 billion, the largest in corporate history. The court found the process that produced it deeply flawed. To many executives and controlling shareholders watching from the outside, the message was alarming. Even in Delaware, even the most powerful founders could have their decisions overturned. The court that promised predictability had just delivered a shock. The reaction was swift, and it acquired a name: DExit. Musk publicly urged companies to flee Delaware, and he led by example, moving Tesla's incorporation to Texas and his other ventures elsewhere. He was not alone. A string of prominent companies, including Dropbox, the hedge fund empire of a famous activist investor, and Musk's own brain implant venture, announced plans to reincorporate in Nevada. Others looked to Texas, which moved aggressively to build a business court of its own to lure them. A trickle threatened to become a trend, and for the first time in living memory, Delaware's monopoly looked genuinely contestable. The states circling Delaware understood exactly what they were competing for, because it is the same prize Delaware itself stole from New Jersey a century ago. Nevada offered powerful legal shields for directors and executives and, crucially, no franchise tax. Texas offered size, political alignment, and a brand new specialized court explicitly modeled to challenge Delaware at its own game. In the most recent wave of the companies proposing to leave Delaware, the largest shares chose Nevada and Texas, a clear signal that the market for corporate law, long a Delaware monopoly, was fragmenting into real competition for the first time in generations. Delaware did not sit still. Recognizing the threat to its Golden Goose, the state moved quickly to amend its own corporate law, passing reforms designed to reassure controlling shareholders and executives that Delaware remained a safe home for them. It was a delicate maneuver, bend far enough to keep the corporations from leaving, but not so far as to destroy the reputation for fairness that made the brand valuable in the first place. In effect, Delaware was doing exactly what it had always done, adjusting its product to keep its customers, guarding the throne it had held for over 100 years. But there is a deeper irony in the DExit story, one that reveals the true nature of the whole system. When companies threaten to leave Delaware, they are not usually fleeing toward more accountability. They are shopping for even friendlier terms, stronger protections for executives, fewer avenues for shareholders to sue, lower fees, lighter oversight. The competition between states is not a race toward transparency and good governance. It is, as one famous critic warned generations ago, a race in the opposite direction. Each state tempted to offer management a little more and the public a little less. And whichever state wins that race, there is one group that consistently loses. Every system that lets money hide has a mirror image. Someone, somewhere, has to make up the difference. The revenue that vanishes through the Delaware loophole does not simply disappear from the universe. It is a shortfall in a state budget that must be filled by higher taxes on people who cannot relocate their profits to a friendly jurisdiction, or by cuts to the schools, roads, and services those taxes were meant to fund. The bill for corporate mobility is paid quietly by those who stay put. Think about who those people are. The small business that operates in a single town cannot spin up a Delaware holding company to license its own brand back to itself. It pays its full share of state tax. The salaried worker cannot route her income through an anonymous LLC. The tax is withheld from every paycheck before she ever sees it. The immobile and the ordinary carry the weight that the mobile and the sophisticated set down. When a multinational shrinks its tax bill by 15 or 20% through a Delaware structure, the government's need for revenue does not shrink with it. The gap is simply shifted onto shoulders less able to shrug it off. The same logic scales up to the global stage. When corrupt officials and tax-dodging elites move their fortunes into American shells and trusts, the losers are the citizens of the countries that wealth was extracted from, often some of the poorest places on Earth, drained of resources that then reappear, laundered and legitimized inside the world's richest economy. The secrecy that a South Dakota trust or a Delaware LLC provides is not a victimless convenience. On the other end of many of these structures is a hospital that was never built, a road that was never paved, a public treasury that was quietly looted while the world's most powerful legal system stood guard over the proceeds. And there's a subtler cost, harder to measure but just as corrosive: the erosion of trust itself. When ordinary people come to believe that the wealthy and the well-advised play by a different set of rules, that profits can be teleported, ownership can be hidden, and reforms can be quietly reversed, something essential in the social contract begins to fray. The sense that the system is rigged is not always paranoia. Sometimes it is an accurate reading of arrangements that were, in fact, designed to work this way, in daylight, with the blessing of the law. If you have followed this channel for a while, you know the pattern by now. The most important machinery of power rarely looks dramatic. It looks like a boring building on Orange Street, a routine filing, a technical exemption buried in a regulatory rule. If this kind of investigation is what you come here for, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who still believes the tax havens are all somewhere far away. And tell us in the comments which hidden system you want us to follow the money into next. Because the story of the American haven is not finished. In fact, it may be approaching the one question that matters most. How long can a system like this actually last? We have traced the machine from a single building to a global phenomenon. From Woodrow Wilson's reforms to Elon Musk's exit, from the Delaware loophole to the Prairie Vaults of South Dakota, from a landmark transparency law to its quiet unmaking. What emerges is not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. There is no secret room, no shadowy cabal. There is something more durable and more unsettling. A system built openly over a century that channels wealth and secrecy toward those who know how to use it, and that springs back into shape every time someone tries to reform it. It is legal, it is stable, and it is enormous. The obvious question is whether it can go on forever, and here honesty requires humility. The pressures on the system are real. International bodies keep pushing for transparency. Journalists keep prying open the leaks. Rival states keep chipping at Delaware's monopoly, and each concession Delaware makes to keep its corporations may erode the very reputation that made it valuable. It is possible to imagine a future in which the walls of secrecy slowly come down, in which beneficial ownership really is disclosed, in which the loopholes are finally closed, in which the American haven is dismantled from within. But it is just as possible to imagine the opposite. What happens if the reforms keep getting reversed the moment attention drifts? What happens if the competition between states accelerates the race to the bottom rather than reversing it? Each jurisdiction offering a little more secrecy, a little more protection to win the next wave of corporations? What happens if the world's money continues to conclude that the safest place to hide is not offshore at all, but inside the most powerful nation on Earth? In that future, the building on Orange Street is not a relic. It is a blueprint. The honest answer is that we do not yet know which way it will break, and that uncertainty is itself the point. Systems like this are not destroyed by a single scandal or saved by a single law. They are contested slowly in the technical language of regulatory rules and court rulings and legislative amendments that almost no one reads, which is precisely why they endure. The most consequential decisions about where the world's wealth hides are made not in headlines but in footnotes, and the people making them are counting on you not to notice. So the next time you hear the phrase tax haven and picture a palm tree and a turquoise sea, remember the tan brick building on Orange Street and the plains of South Dakota and the 99% of companies that were quietly excused from ever revealing who owns them. The largest haven in the world does not hide behind a beach. It hides behind the law in plain sight in the one place no one thought to look. And whether the lights ever truly come on depends less on the powerful who built it than on the ordinary people who finally decide they want to see. Follow the money far enough, and it always leads home.